We also thank you for joining us. We've hosted a conversation series this year and had fantastic conversations. We expect the same today as we talk about digital projects in labor and migration. We have a very wonderful panel joining us, and I'm going to do a brief introduction of all the folks here, both the people in the room and those who are watching via live stream. So I'm going to start here, skipping over Javon for just a second with Ben Blake. Ben Blake is a labor archivist who holds an MA specializing in labor history from Cleveland State and an MILS specializing in labor archives from the University of Pittsburgh. He has over 17 years of experience as an archivist. In April 2016, he became responsible for the Labor History Archives program at the University of Maryland, which includes the historical records of the AFL-CIO. Ben's scholarly interests include union organizing in the Depression era, developing a national documentation strategy for labor archives, and the historical intersection of social justice movements and organized labor. Up next is Will Thomas, who is a PhD student in information studies at iSchool here at the University of Maryland. He's also a graduate assistant for the AADHum initiative. His research focuses on formalized information organization and how collective voice is enabled in the present and shaped by its antecedents in document systems, which organize slavery-based industrial production. He received his MLS at the University of Maryland in 2015. Next on our panel is Dr. Sharon Harley. She is an associate professor in African American Studies department here at the University of Maryland, where she researches and teaches on Black women's labor history and racial and gender politics. She is the editor and contributor to the noted anthologies Sister Circle, Black Women in Work, and Women's Labor in the Global Economy, Speaking in Multiple Voices. Her timetables of African American history was selected by the New York Times as Book of the Month, as well as the History Book of the Month. Dr. Harley has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the W.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research at Harvard University, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Humanities Center at the Research Triangle in North Carolina. Finally on our panel is Dr. Daryl Williams, who is the lead editor of the Rio de Janeiro Reader, Politics, History, Culture, Duke University Press. His single authored publications include Culture Wars in Brazil, The First Vargas Regime, 1930-1945. He's the winner of the American Historical Association's John Edward Fagg Prize and several articles and book chapters on 19th century and 20th century Brazilian cultural history. His current work in progress is The Broken Paths of Freedom, The Free Africans of Cesar in 19th Century Brazilian Slave Society. Williams has held grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright Scholar Program, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship Program, and the Maryland Institute for Technology and Humanities. He currently serves as the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Humanities and has previously served as Associate Director of the David C. Driscoll Center for the Study of African Diaspora. Dr. Williams is also the co-principal investigator for the African American Digital Humanities Initiative. And leading our panel today is our facilitator, Dr. Javon Bickerstaff, who is a relationship coach as well as a scholar of race, gender, and emotions, who studies emotion strategies that couples co-construct to foster emotional intimacy, navigate differences, and cultivate a shared identity. Centering Black couples and theorizing from their experience, her first book project, Loving with the Lights On, Willing Apprenticeship in the Craft of Building Shared Lives, integrates recent developments in gender studies, sociology, and psychology to propose novel, actionable items for grappling with modern relationship tensions. Conceptualizing Black relationships beyond claims of crisis, it attends to expressions of care and wellness and offers a rare window into Black intimate lives. She is currently a postdoctoral associate for the AADHum initiative, a former Ford and Fulbright Fellow. She's a proud alumna of MIT, where she earned degrees in creative writing and urban studies, and she received her PhD in sociology from Harvard. Please join me in welcoming our full panel.
Thanks, Catherine. So we're going to jump right into the conversation. One of the things that's been really important to the AADHum initiative is thinking about the legacies of Black people around the world. And so in uncovering and generating ways to address the kind of historical and current violence and failure of care that happens around the legacies of Black people, we've been paying really critical attention to where and when we enter. And so by way of introduction, let's have everyone answer, how does your own positionality shape your work and vision for the possibilities of studying Black labor or migration? And so Daryl, we'll start with you and we'll come down.
Okay, thank you, Catherine, thank you, Javon, thank you all for being here. So when I think about this, I think about this as myself, obviously as an academic laborer, as an employee of the university, and thinking about, in some ways I have a tremendous amount of freedom, the freedom to have the opportunity and freedom to move from where I live, where I grew up in California, to study in New Jersey, to got to California here in Maryland, and so in some ways a very willful and intentional way of being able to move. And I think about that as some of the freedoms that we have as academics, and particularly academics of color, and academics who study people of color. But I also think about all the restrictions that are part of academics in general. It's not, we don't actually have a lot of freedom to move. If I wanted to move to Pittsburgh tomorrow, I couldn't. I wouldn't have a job there, most likely. But also, in some ways, that's about the structured nature of it. But also, I think in my role, particularly in academic affairs, I recognize that not just are we bound by certain kinds of institutional employment relationships, but also bound and sometimes restricted by the disparities which come from professional development for scholars of color, and I see this very much in my role as an associate dean for faculty affairs, and there are real racial and ethnic disparities when it comes to getting jobs, moving forward in one's career path, but also the general scarcity for scholars of color in academics. We have this kind of image that if you're a talented scholar of color, you can write your own ticket. Well, that is not really true. But even for those people, those small number of people, we think about the larger number of people who are actually not there at all. They're not in the academy. They weren't given the opportunities to get to the academy in the first place, particularly in the higher research world. And that is this kind of lack of freedom, this boundedness, this exclusion that I can certainly recognize, and to a certain degree I can understand in the experience, and more importantly, it's something which I have to grapple with very much in my own professional and ethical life as a scholar.
Well, in my case, it's surprising that I sort of merged my interest in politics and radical activism with my interest in labor. So although I was deeply committed to studying working class women, I actually started out by studying some of the most elite black women, Mary Church Terrell and Anna Julia Cooper, and it just dawned on me that partly I was fascinated by these women because their archival materials were readily available. And so then I kind of reverted and started studying more about working class women, and discovered that their knowledge of Mary Church Terrell was not mine, that they knew a woman by the name of Nannie Helen Barrows, who was a Black Baptist woman. And it was only after interviewing 100 black women who had lived in Washington at some point prior to 1930 that I realized that even though I knew Mary Church Terrell, probably many of you know her, they didn't have a clue about who she was. So I had to go back and rewrite that section of my dissertation and designate her as a leader and somebody who middle-class people knew, but not working class. So then I started studying more about working class women, and one of my most popular articles was about a woman who was in the underground economy, who was a sort of numbers backer and did lots of different things. And my colleague, Mary Helen Washington, wanted me to admit that my parents must have been involved in that kind of underground economy, which is why I was interested in that particular woman. Well, in some ways, I wish they had, because the only person in my high school who had a car in the 10th grade was supposedly the daughter of someone like that. But I've really been always fascinated by working class women's activism, and I go back and forth, and as we go along, I'll talk about how that's affected my work.
Afternoon, everybody. There are a couple of ways in which I come to this particular topic, and part of it is through just my learned experience as living in the household that I grew up in. My mom was an educator for most of her professional life, so this meant that from a very early age I had not only exposure to labor unionism, but also in terms of the difficulties that it had in oppositional environments. We grew up in Virginia. Virginia was a right-to-work state. So, this meant that I inculcated the sense of these ideas from a very early point. And then, getting my bachelor's in computer science, I went into a world in which many of these things were ignored. Computer science is largely resistant to unionism. So I had to relearn and reconnect to the importance of unions in terms of securing rights, and also the connections to African Americans, to the Black experience. Coming here and doing the and getting my master's here helped me to bring those two things together, especially as I came to understand that the African American participation in the labor movement went back to the time of slavery, that the drapetomania, the supposed mental illness that Black people had that made them run away from plantations, was an attempt to constrain Black labor, and was the Black attempt to define the conditions of their work. That when the Civil War came and there were the mass migrations off the plantations to cross the Union lines to force first the field orders for the Emancipation Proclamation, and then ultimately for President Lincoln to do it, that these were Black people escaping from labor camps, in doing a general strike, and producing, and enacting a labor movement, inventing essentially a labor movement. And on through the Great Migration and the creation of DC as Chocolate City. What drives me now is the understanding that we cannot simply have the recontextualization of this material living in, even though it's very important that academic articles are written about this, and books are written about this, and conferences are held, and conversations like this occur, but we need to think about the long-term preservation of the recontextualization of that data, who sits at the table when that's done, and what the norms are which drive that. And so, that is how that's how my research interests have evolved in thinking about this. In thinking about who sets the context and how the norms for that are drawn up, and recognizing that that's a community process that can't be a mechanical process. There have to be people in the loop. And to be very blunt, there have to be Black people in the loop for that to be meaningful. I'm not pretending that I have answers to all that today, but that certainly is what draws me into this conversation.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. I think my interest in history started when I was 13 years old. Newark, Ohio, what's now considered Trump country, and very conservative. And I was in the public library and I discovered a book on the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and that triggered my interest in history and the absence of African Americans in my textbooks, and really from my history courses in junior high school and high school. So I went on to read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and of course that really changed my life. And from there, fast forward to here at Maryland, the AFL-CIO collection, I've been at the job about 2 years now. We have a tremendous, the Civil Rights Department collection within the AFL-CIO records is probably one of, if not the best collection on organized labor and the struggle for racial equality in the country. And that's a legacy of an archivist, Linda Deloach, at the Mini Archives that we inherited when the collection was transferred to us. So today, I kind of see my job as figuring out ways to kind of create the sparks that will interest people to delve into the collection, which is a very traditional archival collection. They're finding aids, it's very well organized, but through those finding aids, that's not necessarily a way that really, from the surface of it, really creates that interest or really expresses what's really in the collections, which is incredible. So, for example, our work on the exhibit was an attempt to do that. And I think things like digitizing video that we have on, that was originally for MLK Holiday video from 1985, but it has tremendous footage in it. So digitizing that, getting it on the web, integrating it as part of our collection, and having one of the central sections of our exhibit that's in Hornbeck Library's gallery now and online is to make African American history central to the history of labor. So that's kind of like my main job, because really without African American history, there is no labor history. It is absolutely central. African American history is a driving force, and what we try to do in the exhibit is kind of give that overview where you look at 19th century and how, in many ways, the mainstream labor movement was very conservative and racist. The AFL, segregation, exclusion. You had a battle that was ongoing, and then you have kind of an arc where, over a period of time, the interaction between the civil rights movement and the struggle for equality interacted with the labor movement and fundamentally transformed the labor movement. I mean, there's still a tremendous amount of struggle and work to be done, but it changed things from an organization that reflected the racism in society to an organization that sees a responsibility in struggling against it. And so that's kind of the story that I want to work on making available, not only to students here on campus and for scholars, which is the traditional role of archives and was the role of media archives, but also for people in general, for the public, for the kind of population of the world through the web.
So in thinking about the comments that you all have had, one of the things that it brings to mind is how we do remembering. And Will, in one of the blogs that you wrote for AADHum about the digitization of the AFL-CIO records, you have this phrase that remembering requires choices, right? We know that there's always this kind of politics of preservation that goes on. We can't keep everything. Right. And there historically aren't records on everything. Some narratives kind of rise to the forefront and others stay in the background if they get recorded and recognized at all. And so one of the things I'd like us to talk a bit more about is how you grapple with these absences and these silences that you hear in your work. Sharon, one of the things that kind of came to mind as you were talking about the difference between working class and middle class and upper middle class for some of them women is that that's one of the challenges in thinking about it. But there's also the challenge of, if you think about certain historical eras, women aren't necessarily seen in those eras. If we think about the New Negro movement and how it's remembered, it's Du Bois and it's Booker T. Washington, and it's their challenges with one another. And yet we know there's Mary Church Terrell, Fannie Williams, Nanny Burroughs, and of course Ida B. Wells. And so how have you tried to grapple with shifting that kind of public understanding in your work?
I almost always, whatever I write about, have a section about the politics of erasure. It's not even preservation, it's erasure. So how does somebody like Gloria Richardson, who was on the front cover of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, and local Cambridge newspapers, get written out of civil rights scholarship? How does that happen? And why does it happen? And it happens in part because she's a woman. It happens in part because she advocated for working class people. She advocated in a way that even Martin Luther King found disturbing. She advocated in a way that no holds barred. She refused to accept nonviolence as an appropriate response to violence. Well, these things were problematic, not only for King, but for other civil rights leaders. Part of course, she leaves the area. She leaves Cambridge, she goes to New York. But whatever I write about, almost, and I tell students, I try to help myself and not include a section on the politics of erasure. How do these women get written up? In the case of Gloria Richardson, it isn't because they're not records. She's on the front cover of these newspapers for 18 months. This is a deliberate erasure. And so part of what my work involves is bringing these people back into the fold. We can't really understand King if we don't understand that she pushed him to advocate for economic justice, not just civil rights laws. And so whenever people ask me to come and speak about King, I have him put a conversation, an imagined conversation with Gloria Richardson and with some other woman who influenced his thinking, even if it only occurred years later. So I deliberately make an effort to talk about just the question you ask. These women played prominent, significant, groundbreaking roles, even revolutionary roles, and they get written out, and I talk about how that happened and why.
Thinking about the civil rights movement in particular, you know, we've just had this, and for the rest of 2018, we'll be having these moments of reflecting back on 1968. We just commemorated the loss of King in 1968. Thinking about the work that happened in labor unions in particular, women get written out in ways that are because of things that are about how we want to remember, but then there are also the ways in which there's the erasure that happened because they were in the room, but they were doing work that wasn't deemed something that needed to be recorded. They weren't the leaders, they weren't the ones speaking, they were the ones keeping the record so that we can look at what is now the meeting archive. Ben, as you've developed this exhibit, and the exhibit is for Liberty, Justice, and Equality, Unions Making History in America, how have you been able to see both the absences and to pull out some of that information? And that's also a question for you as well, Will, in thinking about the things that you decided to preserve as you were doing some of the record sorting for AADHum's initiative and
Sure.
digitization.
I think one of the biggest weaknesses of the AFL-CIO collection is there's no women's department records. They're in a part of an ocean of 15,000 feet of material that's unprocessed that is closed right now that I'm negotiating, have been for quite a while. Hopefully soon we'll be able to start opening up some of those records, but there isn't that much that was saved. There were some key, like the experience of women in the labor movement in many ways paralleled the experience of African Americans. You had the same kind of an arch where late 19th century, early 20th century, you had exclusion. So you had the formation of the International Lady Garment Workers Union, which based in New York, based largely on immigrant women's organizing, which was organized independently of the American Federation of Labor, and basically knocked on the door saying, let us in. And finally the AFL let in the ILGW in 1910, just very similar to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which again, after a big struggle, was admitted in 1935. And those unions were formed outside the official labor movement and then basically waged a struggle to be admitted into the official movement. And so the AFL records from 1881 through the mid-1950s, there's almost very little on women workers and actually very little on African American. There was no civil rights department in the AFL. There was no even director or organizer specifically appointed. And there was a similar position in terms of women. So I kind of see one of my jobs is figuring out ways to overcome that. So in the exhibit, we have a section on women in the labor movement and that talks about this kind of interaction where women organizing independently then wage a struggle and get admitted to the labor movement, and then wage a similar struggle to gain equality within the movement and get the movement to back broader women's issues. So then by the 60s and 70s, you have the Coalition of Labor Union Women and Organization 9 to 5, which again, we don't have much records. Those records are officially at the Reuther Library, which kind of reflects the more progressive CIO wing of the movement that started in the 30s on, Walter Reuther. So they ended up at the Reuther Library. But we have kind of some scattered records that my goal is to bring those together, you know, make them visible and available to researchers. A lot of it is in videotape, like the various conferences of CLU and some of the organizing around 9 to 5. But that's one of, like, in contrast to civil rights, where we had a dedicated archivist who really worked for years building that collection, processing that collection, and making sure it was a priority within the Meany archives. We didn't have a similar effort in terms of women's involvement in the AFL and the AFL-CIO. So that's kind of one of the big things I've got to work on correcting. And the exhibit section is kind of a small contribution to that, where we're trying to find those scattered things that really are useful and illustrate the struggle women have had and continues in the labor movement.
One of the things in doing the processing, you know, I was part of a small team that went through folder by folder looking at records from the civil rights collection to do an assessment. And very early on, I realized that I was going to have to make a conscious effort to look for the women in these records. You know, that if I did not make the conscious effort to do so, that other than the few famous names that it was impossible to ignore, that they would become invisible. And so I started having to pay attention to the role of clerical staff in producing these records, because those were largely women. And seeing how that labor is made invisible. Many folks don't remember back when there was such a thing as a full-on clerical staff where you didn't do your own typing. But you know, in these documents, you know, the men have names and the women have initials at the bottom behind a slash, and they're in lowercase too. One thing that also struck me, though, in addition to the role of women as representative of a martyr, in other words, a man is killed in a labor action, and his widow is then given a voice to be able to speak, were the case files where folks were going into the field to deal with labor grievances. Because, of course, women at the center of those labor grievances had to get a voice. One of my regrets in terms of doing this work is that we did not have enough time to go through that huge volume of those case files, because these are, in contradistinction to the people sitting in offices in Washington, in New York, and in Chicago, these were women in Alabama and Louisiana and Virginia who were dealing with the full panoply of, Me Too is much older than, you know, than Twitter, dealing with the full panoply of that. You know, so there are, you know, not all, the erasure was not total, but there is a much greater amount of work that's needed to pull those voices out, and I was able to get a real sense of that in going through these records and you know, trying to think about contextualization of those, especially of the labor grievance records.
So, along with being the analog person on our team, I am very clearly a presentist, right? And so, thinking about all of the work you do, there's an element of kind of detective work and the kind of historical work that all of you do in various forms. Dara, I know that you're a partner in this newly funded Mellon initiative, Enslaved, the People of the Historic Slave Trade. That's an online hub of global slave trade data that's going to be housed at Michigan State University. And in an article about this new collaboration, you mentioned that everything that was built in the Americas between the 16th and 19th century was a product of slave labor. We know that, right? In a sense, like, it's clear that this doesn't exist without slave labor. We know the facts of that statement, and you know, back in the good old days of 2016, when Forever Flotus would mention often that I live in a house that was made by slaves. We know that in terms of the facts, but our consciousness of that seems to live somewhere underneath, somewhere hidden. And it certainly goes against the kind of American mythos of bootstrapping and self-made anything. In what you all are doing in bringing this collection together, how does working with the digital allow us to kind of disrupt that absence and those silences around things so that we begin to think in a really kind of present way that none of this exists without the labor of Black folks?
So, part of it, I think, in this particular project, and those people who have been both have gravitated to the project and also are contributing, is that though there's a fairly large number, the majority are North American and North American trained scholars, we're globalists in the sense of, or we're not globalists, I'm a Brazilianist, or people who work on various places in Africa, there's people in the Caribbean. So when you begin from those places,
Yes.
this is not so disruptive. It could be something that might be an unpleasant or something that you don't necessarily want to stress, but it is not a revelation in a place like Brazil, the destination for the largest number of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Places in Rio, for instance, 40–50% of the population was enslaved. A much larger percentage was Black in much of the 19th century. It's not an unusual kind of statement to make. But I think more broadly, when we think about this project, which is based in the United States, largely with the wealth and the infrastructure that we have from higher education, is to use that to place the United States as one of the many spaces built and made by enslavement and freedom and enslaved people and free people. But also we're particularly interested right now in telling people's stories and the naming of the individuals. So we can talk about slaves or we can talk about enslaved peoples, and they can become a sort of large anonymized group. But we're all focused very much on individuals who had names. Not just we know that intellectually, but we're trying to find archivally what their names were. How do we demonstrate that in a very specific, concrete, data-based way, but also many of us are trying to bring the digitized archival materials also to the fore. So you don't have to go to the archive, physical archive, but to come to a digital place and see them, and to see that name, person registered, maybe written in their own hand, most likely not, but certainly oftentimes written at their initiation, various kinds of petitions, to bring that sort of nakedness to whatever the issue is in the documentary record, oftentimes revolving around issues about labor, wages, conditions of work, access to work, mobility of work, but also many other aspects. I do think about this, to bridge this conversation we just had about the erasures. One of the pitfalls that we have in this project right now, and I know in my own work, is we're very much focused on named individuals. So finding documents, registries, other things in which named individuals. What do we do with the individuals? And I'll use a very concrete case. This ship I work on, this slave ship, leaves Angola in early 1838, arrives near Brazil in April 1838, intercepted by a British cruiser. There are about 210 Africans aboard. They become this group called Liberated Africans. But in the process between their interception of the British cruiser and their actual liberation, 2 are kidnapped. 2 boys are kidnapped. There's a registry, 2 boys are kidnapped. So we have 2 kidnapped boys. But they're never given a name because they were kidnapped before this process of assigning Christian names. Do they become part of the record? In the database perspective, there's a database which is a name database. Do we have 2 kidnapped boys? Well, that's different than having the João Marias, Baratos, Joanas, who are names. We know those 2 kidnapped boys were part of that experience, and most likely they were kidnapped to become slaves, and certainly to labor in Brazilian society. And this is a dilemma that we have, a choice, not just about do we create a separate column, the unnamed, but on the ship, or do we put them in the named column, but yet there is no name? And it's these kind of choices that we have, certainly because we don't, in a digital perspective, want to re-erase them, but yet we also are trying to put our place upon, an argument is the inscription of a name is how they are brought to our knowledge, or brought to the present in particular. And this is it's kind of a technical dilemma, it's an ethical dilemma that we're struggling with right now.
So there's all of the work that we do to think about this politics of erasure, the choices that we make that you all have talked about. There's also the labor that goes into making these projects occur, right? There's the work that the researchers are doing, there's the work that archivists do as they're helping researchers to do the work. There are the graduate students and undergraduate students that are doing the work and thinking about the ways that, you know, Will points out that the men have names, the women have initials, right? How do we go about creating ethical standards to make sure that in the kind of work that we're doing on these projects that we're doing today, that we don't replicate and perpetuate the same kinds of erasures and hierarchies that eliminate folks from getting recognition? So if you think about the work that you're doing right now, whether it's creating the exhibits or in this massive project that's 8 different collections of people who are or projects in different universities that are coming together to create this database, how do we make sure that we're thinking about the labor that goes involved in making sure that everybody is recognized in that work as well?
I think so. For me, it's a variety of ways in which you do that. I have an undergraduate research assistant, and I asked her what, for instance, one gets paid, and it was like some low amount. And so I said, well, I'll pay you a living wage. She said, well, Dr. Harley, you don't have to do that. I said, but you're a worker, I'm a worker, and so, and you have, at this moment, probably more financial needs than I do, so I think you have to embody that in your interaction with people. I want to go back and emphasize that the politics of erasure isn't just about not having them there. It's about why people erase certain individuals. Right. What is the politics behind that? Why was Gloria Richardson uncomfortable for Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and other people? And I also want to broaden our definition of leader. Because if we think about Ella Baker, then the leader isn't just king. There would be no king, and or there would be no NAACP were not all the grassroots work of women involved in various political struggles and labor struggles. And we have to thank the great work of Tara Hunter for helping us broaden our understanding and conception of labor protest and labor resistance. So my more recent work, for instance, is about working class women and Pan-Africanist struggles. So moving beyond Du Bois and Mary Church Terrell, I embraced this woman, Queen Mother Moore, who had a 4th grade education, but was relentless in her push for Pan-Africanism and engaging in Pan-Africanist struggle. And I had to find material in trade union organizations because she was a labor organizer for rent strikes in Harlem and other places. But she only had a 4th grade education, so there is no autobiographical text. I find her on YouTube. I find her, fortunately, Schlesinger Library did a great collection of Black women's oral history collection, and she was interviewed there, and I asked to use her, to quote from her, a paper I gave in South Africa. I didn't hear back from Schlesinger because they had to ask the family. I quoted from her, but I didn't publish the quote until Schlesinger got back to me. So I think we should embody in our work our understanding of labor and the ethical aspect. And then lastly, when I happened to have a reception at my house for Black women faculty, and faculty who were writing about Black women, all 18 of us, it was Bonnie Thornton, Dale Murray, Washington, we went around the room and we introduced ourselves, and we had been on campus together for years, but never really knew each other. And 18 of the women were doing some aspect of women's labor, broadly speaking. So whether it was Mary Helen Washington studying labor, and we went from there to get a major grant, and we had our first meeting at the National Labor Union, and we met with all kinds of people. So we broadened our understanding of work, and we paid each other. In other words, when I got the Ford grant, usually academics, best kept secret. We work a lot for free on the campus and off the campus. So we paid everybody $2,000. That's not a whole ton of money, but academics usually get no money because I wanted to say I value your work and what you're doing. So I think we have to embody that. And it went on and, published 2 book projects and, had lots and lots of money back in the day from the Ford Foundation. So I think we need to embody what we study, not just study it.
I'd say, and this sounds very mundane, but spreadsheets, particularly Google Sheets, now provides us with an incredible amount of tracking and surveillance, which includes information about who did what when. Now, I don't think we've properly, in this big database, networked initiative that I'm part of, the majority of the time for the researchers is working with spreadsheets. There's a whole set of programmers and designers who are doing other kinds of things, but the majority of us who are historians are working in spreadsheets. Very dull. Extremely dull. But particularly if those people who use Google Sheets, which is I'm one of them, every single entry is tracked. And so who specifically did that, when they did it, is information which is now much more available and possibly transparent and recognizable than it would be in the past, in which that information, having a research assistant or doing it yourself, like someone worked on it, I don't know how, the information got there, and then eventually then also, of course, gets digested into something which is synthetic and most often single-authored, being authored by a very small number of people. So I do think this is where the areas where the tools of digital humanities are actually going to provide us with at least the opportunity, maybe who knows about the ethos or not, the opportunities to be clearer about recognizing the type of labor that you're discussing here that actually produces not only the raw materials, but actually also the incredible amount of high-level conceptual, interpretive, analytical effort and product which comes out of producing a spreadsheet, producing a data set, making that data set available. So put that out here as I think it maybe we can mark as a moment of what Google, which is also tracking us and everything like Facebook, actually may also be used as our own ally in some of what you're discussing.
I guess in picking up on that a little bit, that we need to seriously and persistently, and until it's resolved, address the gender and racial inequities in the tech industry. Because the platforms that we're targeting with this material as we transform it into its new digital surrogates is going to be the web or the successor to whatever the web is. And who gets to build that, who understands the infrastructure of that, is going to be overrepresented in who designs the norms for it and who thinks what is appropriate for it and who has the voices that are seen as authoritative as saying what the platforms can and can't do. And I don't want to have Mark Zuckerberg or Sergey Brin or Larry Page dominating those conversations, to be very honest. I don't want to see a perpetuation of what we have now in Wikipedia, where we have to have a Women in Red project because of the number of women who get referenced in a Wikipedia page that don't have an article about them because nobody thought it was worth the time to do. Because of the incredible skew by race and gender of who are Wikipedia editors and who are Wikipedia admins. And so I think that that's really germane here in terms of driving how driving how those norms evolve is addressing the distribution of literacy with these technologies and the competencies to use them, shape them, and build new ones.
I think, to me, in terms of the inequalities within the archival profession, we hired 2 graduate assistants for the exhibit, part of the posting and the process of interviewing were questions like, what is your experience in promoting diversity in, you know, your educational background, in your work background? Those kind of questions actually, I think, are very important. So any hiring process really needs to be asking those questions, and the result and the answers that we got back in the interview were very telling and really were fundamental in the decision-making process. I think in terms of the exhibit, the policy of special collections is not to name the curators. So none of us were named, you know, in our team, and they are named on the website, but not on the exhibit itself. And when we opened the exhibit, I had kind of prepared this speech. Of course, I'm a terrible public speaker, too nervous to really, you know. So I basically threw it out, and I just recognized all the people who did the work on the project. And I think in the course of hiring the 2 graduate assistants, will then funding out, not anything to do with the libraries, but outside the library, the funding for those 2 positions were outside the libraries. Well, in the middle of their 2-year GA-ship, that was pulled out of the blue without any prior notice. So we had to, fortunately, the dean and associate dean in the library got restoration of one of the funding, and then the other we gave a contract position so they could finish out their MLIS program. And so that, I think, at least in a small way, we were able to support and correct something that really was, to me, very unfair. In the broader picture, if you look at union wages and wage scales, a union archivist makes, you know, $75,000 a year with full benefits. You know, part-time archivists would range, you know, at an hourly rate, maybe $25 an hour with benefits. So that's a very small number of people, but if it's unionized, that would be tremendous. Of course, on this campus, you know, it's a struggle. And I've lost the 2 graduate assistants, so I will be operating with probably 1 student worker in the labor archives. We've restructured to kind of focus on processing. So the resource issues and the priorities are really within scarce resources, though. I think you can still prioritize diversity, and that has to be consciously done. And then once people are hired in, the key questions are, how do you develop that graduate, like for us, because there's the wages and so forth are pretty minimal. It's more about getting the experience and developing the skills and developing the resume that will get you a job and make you part of the profession of archivists. And one of our GAs just landed a job. The other, I think, is going to land one very soon. Part of it is, you know, we have a great high school and everything that really helps. But I do think that that's kind of part of that is thinking about how you make the profession more diverse within your projects, and that's really critical. And I think that starts with the hiring process.
So officially, this conversation is digital projects and labor and migration. And I want us to think a bit more about the intersection between labor and migration. We know that they are in so many ways intertwined. For instance, despite, you know, while the unions and the NAACP and Urban League, they were engaged in different ways to address how black labor was being de-skilled under slavery and under Jim Crow, as migration moved people up north, those laborers from the rural South, there was all this resistance from opening the skilled trades, from being able to be incorporated into the unions. And so there's this tension between how we understand labor and the way that it works, and how the need for labor creates certain kinds of migrations. And so when we think about that, Ben, I want you to talk to us a bit more about the exhibit and thinking about how black union workers and their ideas moved as they were doing the kind of work that they were doing, both to move the organization further, but also to kind of have to move themselves in a lot of ways, and how those shifts and changes help us understand how the AFL-CIO was able to develop in the ways that it did.
I think one of the things if you look at the official record of the AFL, kind of in that late 19th century, early 20th, up to the World War I era, you know, I was looking at the index for the American Federation, which is the main publication in that period, and there were 3 articles on African Americans, and they were all 3 articles were under the headline, "The Black Labor Problem." So you're like, that's incredible. I mean, you're thinking like, this is how it was officially indexed by the American Federation of Labor in 1914. And so in the exhibit, I mean, what we tried to do in that period was bring in key figures like Frederick Douglass, which is absent from our official labor archives. He's not in there. You know, our records really start 1881, and so that, you know, it isn't there partly reflecting the you know, racism within the AFL and conservatism, but the key issue here is that Frederick Douglass' position is, particularly in relation to like pretty much through the 19th century, and then it carried on, is the question of exclusion. And okay, what do you do? Okay, the official labor movement, for example, there was a huge battle within the machinists who were Southern-based. This is in the 1880s, 1890s, and officially you had a colored bar, you know, right in their constitution. And so there was a battle within AFL, you know, that was kind of reflected in the more radical wings and tradition of like the Knights of Labor. That was lost, and then that conservative position was consolidated, and the tolerance of exclusion and segregation by the 1890s. So like people like Frederick Douglass's position was, if the official labor movement will not let us in, we will organize on our own. And there were a number of efforts to do that. And even if, you know, a union that's on strike, Fred Douglass wrote an article, it's fairly obscure, but important, saying that the equality issue overrides that. Like if it's a labor union that excludes African Americans, it's not going to be successful without unity within the working class. So our position is we will break strikes if we're excluded from that union, to make the point that you need to include us, and that's how you build a strong labor movement. And like during the World War I era, I think a lot of the strikes and things, I'm familiar with the steelworkers strike in 1919. Literally what happened there was employers went down to the South, recruited African American workers, put the worker, and promised all kinds of things, you know, without telling the workers that there was a strike going on, put those workers in cattle cars, brought them up to places like Gary, Indiana, unloaded them within a steel mill that was a barbed wire prison with machine guns around it. And that's, you know, that was the reality. And then, but what happened is that even that, and then, well, actually later then, the steel companies, U.S. Steel, then fired all those workers after the, or most of the workers after the strike. So that kind of dynamic is really critical, that dynamic of kind of the independent organization of African Americans, putting that pressure on the labor movement to change and like let us in, you know, basically quit being, you know, stupid, like quit, there's always that contradiction in terms of the AFL making the conservative economic argument about, well, African Americans were quote unquote cheap labor, so we have to exclude cheap labor, just like sort of immigrants today, some similar kind of argument. And people like Frederick Douglass, which we included in the exhibit, countered that argument and basically said, you know, no, that the only reason that it's cheap, that's because the employers pay it. We don't determine that. If you let us in, you know, we're very happy to accept, you know, the higher wages that you're trying to create in an exclusionary kind of environment.
That makes a lot of sense. Thinking about those ways that we see these interactions between labor and migration, the movement of ideals, the movement of organizations, we know that there are also class differences. Sharon, you mentioned that you began being interested in working class women. You were pulled towards these black club women, and that the black working class women that you were interested in didn't necessarily know them. How did you see the ways that their movement, these black women, and where they came from, DC, as somebody from the Midwest, I'm clear that DC is the South, right? I love DC because when I came down here, it was like, oh, people acknowledge your existence, having been in cold New England for such a long time, right? And so thinking about migration and labor in those intersections, particularly for those working class women, where did you see those intersections?
Well, first, as a native Washingtonian, third generation, we still don't think we're in the South. And we tend to have varying reactions, not all positive, to people, at least when I was growing up, who are really from the South, like Georgia, or Alabama, or someplace like that, but that has changed. In terms of my own work, I focus on black women, so I take their labor struggles where it exists. So if it doesn't exist, for instance, in the trade unions, then where does it exist? And so I think one of my most recent articles titled Race Women that grew out of a Second Ford Foundation grant that we finished up in Bellagio, Italy, a great place to finish a book project. I was really interested in black women's trade unionism, did not find a lot, but what I found was that the 4 women that I studied for this project were all engaged in labor unionism through kind of a cultural production, and I was shocked. So it's Shirley Graham Du Bois, one of the people I write about, and her kind of labor engagement is articulated in plays. Hadn't thought about it. There's Louise Thompson Patterson, who has a BA in economics, from Berkeley in 1920s, couldn't find a job. She ends up teaching at Hampton after a series of secretarial jobs on her way from the West Coast to Hampton. Well, she joins Langston Hughes and has a theater production play that promotes trade unions. And then there's Billie Holiday, who engages in kind of labor and promotion through various, surprisingly, socialist groups, because all my women are radical women. I don't know why I'm drawn to radical women. I mean, my own radical background, kind of, some of you know, I started out at a Catholic women's college to play field hockey, and I ended up in the Black Panther Party. So there's that middle class to that radical activist transition into my own life. And so these women I all studied were either involved in the socialist movement, who became communists, and then there's Nanny Helen Barrows, who I wanted to exclude from my project, but although she promoted a labor union, you know, more of a sort of a middle class association of workers, and she was a strong feminist, but I wanted to exclude her because she wasn't, quote, radical enough. She didn't join the Socialist Party or the Communist Party. Thankfully, Elsa Barkley Brown, who was one of the participants in the group, insisted that I include Nanny Helen Barrows. And it turns out she's probably the most radical of the group because she had to go up against black churchmen, whereas these other women did. And so I think in looking at labor unionism, if we're looking at certain groups of people, we have to look for the labor union, but also go beyond labor union. So I sort of, in some ways, study women where they are and their engagement and struggles wherever that may be, and therefore broaden our definition of both leadership, political engagement, and cultural engagement. And both Harvard and NYU have had a series of global conferences on the visual representation of labor and migration. And so my most recent work was Beyond the Sorbonne, about this woman, Queen Mother Moore. And the other women all had gone to the Sorbonne and they'd studied there, but she didn't because she'd only had that 4th grade education. And that's how does her politics look different from the other women I studied?
We know that digital humanities has been at the forefront of a lot of inquiry on spatial analysis of Black migration and Black movement. Whether that's enslaved or free people during periods of slavery, Reconstruction, the Great Migration. One of the things that I wonder is, what do we do with folks who are in the liminal spaces, right? Spaces that it's not clear where they're at or what they are. And so Daryl, and the work that you do with the folks designated liberated Africans, right, who get removed from these slave ships and these coastal prisons, and yet they're not quite free. They're in this kind of semi-free, pseudo-enslaved state. How are their movements tracked? How do you keep track of them? How are they recognized in the records, given the fact that they inhabit this space that's hard in some ways to define?
So the specific group, this particular group is remarkable in some ways because they operate into a regime of surveillance, state surveillance, that is higher in many ways than enslaved or free people, just regular free people. And in that way it produces a lot of documentation, which helps to sort of track movements, because most, not all, but much of that documentation can be situated in certain sort of spaces in the movement between them. But there's also some rather specific ways in which they're tracked, particularly the ones I work on, which are about in Rio, which include street addresses. So in some ways, some of the work, my earlier work at Digital Humanities was literally to take like what would be equivalent of like a Google Maps for 19th century Rio and plot people in very specific, like this house in relationship to that place and that square. So it produces a way in which space and location and people and geolocational information can be really quite visually, it can be visualized and can be quite, seemingly telling. But a couple things I would sort of caution that we discovered. First of all, and I think this is a larger case here about mapping, particularly mapping and movement, is for the most part in digital humanities, unless you have a very sophisticated project, you have a base map that seems to suggest a certain time period, but probably only suggests a specific time period. Space itself changes, urban space, non-urban space changes themselves. So specifically in Rio, the base map that we started out is really based on a map for the installation of gasworks in 1863, but it's mapping information over a 30-year period. So first of all, we have we're mapping information over a 30-year period on a map which is very specific to a specific time period, but what it also seems to what it doesn't capture is the actual urban space was changed by the individuals because many of them were assigned to do urban works to build out the city grid network. So you have the individuals moving in a fixed city, but the city itself is being changed by those individuals.
Right.
So this is a kind of a dilemma that we have, not just in this particular project, but I think more broadly when we think about mapping, movement, labor, digital humanities. Of course, there are very sophisticated ways to also make the map and the space itself dynamic, but it adds a whole kind of other level. The other thing is, what do you do with things that are off the map, off your map as it were, off your screen? If you want to think about that, those people who fall either not necessarily marginal. They may not actually be marginal. They might have actually information about how to understand their movement to another place. Right. But your particular frame, as it were, only has a specific set of limitations to it. Well, in a sense, if they're off the map, the project itself has marginalized them in a way that actually in historical documentation and the historical reality, maybe it wasn't so marginal. And so these are, again, this kind of DH project design dilemmas that need to be grappled with, and hopefully address some of the larger questions, documented, but still in the documentation, and decisions are made. And decisions, particularly over time, become naturalized to a user who then understands this to be the real, or the possible, even more so. And that has certain implications for what you're trying to argue, how that argument is going to be interpreted by a user or other researchers, users. So.
Well, in listening to Daryl's comments, Trevor will be proud of me. He mentioned that we have these base maps, but our base maps are static, right? And he's mentioned movement of space, how the space actually changes, how the people are changing the space, how that is changing over the course of time.
Right.
And so I think that often when we think about maps, we think about people moving, right? So somebody who, I don't tell people that I was once a planner, but once a planner, right? Thinking about the kind of movement that happens, there's the actual movement of bodies, but there are other kinds of movement and migrations that we can think about. And so if you think about the kind of work that you want to do, what other things, if you had like your ideal understanding of a layer, like what kind of layers would you like to be able to understand better and to be able to lay over the things that we already know?
Well, that gets to the representation of time. That just by speaking of migration, we're acknowledging that people are not fixed in space. The people are moving in time, so they're changing in time. But we also have to understand that they are moving into built environments. And so that moving into built environments means that we have to be able to accommodate, depending on what the time scale of our layers are, we have to be able to accommodate that change. We have to be able to reason in some way over how that built environment changes in time. To be able to talk about how, to be able to start to think about causality. How did this migration change this space? We need to be able to reason about both of those. So we would need layers that we can see the transformations, or we can infer the transformations in a way that we can reason about them. Between, okay, in 1950, the area around here was much more rural than it is now. And see the buildings of the layings of roads and buildings of houses, and preferably to have that be animatable, so that we have a visual representation of how that transformation goes. That it's not simply statically, here's a picture and here's another picture 30 years later, and you fill in the dots. To be able to have those layers evolve in time in the frame of the screen that you're looking at them, so that you can better see them and better be able to talk about them. I think that's important, and also being able to to capture better the decision making and the labor that went into those changes. I mean, Megan, I believe you were the one who mentioned that today is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Fair Housing Act, which transformed this county utterly. I would not own my house if it weren't for that act. So, being able to tie those broader decisions and tie individual and collective choice into the features that we're seeing in our maps as a form of metadata about them, I think is also useful.
So,
can I add something here? So this is a project not from Black TH, but I was familiar with this at Stanford at the Center for Study Textual Spatial Analysis. So someone was working on 18th century, 19th century London in literature. And so they were studying how various place names were then associated with various kinds of emotive sort of states in a series of texts there. So it was really interesting, because then they provided a map of how a particular place was associated with certain kinds of emotional, sentimental. And I imagine a dream would be, in this case, how do we not just map out movements of people and labor, families, built environment, but also how do we imagine a certain place to be? What does that imaginary look like? So this is where we move into areas that are in literature or maybe cultural fields. They're not necessarily based on sort of a body or a thick set of policies, but rather dreams. And how do those get also then layered in? Do those correspond? If we have a dream of a certain place associated with freedom, does that actually, is it associated with a certain sort of movement of freedom or freedom to buy or whatever those questions are? And I think those could be really interesting ways to bring cultural and socioeconomic things together, layered in together within a spatial environment, spatialized environment, a visualized spatialized environment.
An Afrofuturist take on it.
And I want you all to hold on, because you're all teaming. Daryl's brought up these ideas, and so I want you to hold on to what that has brought up for you, but I want to make sure that if there are questions from the audience, we have about 10 minutes where we have time, so before I let you launch into that, are there any questions?
So I think an interesting aspect of labor and Black studies we haven't talked about is mass incarceration and convict labor. And so thinking about how, like, 13, I'm sure we've all seen a documentary about when that was passed, so often labor was actually used as a form of punishment, as a way of sustaining sort of this idea of free Black labor in the South post-slavery. And so I should know if that has come up in archival records and how that sort of the evolution of slavery through both convict labor but also like sharecropping as ways to sort of bring in more inclusive voices. So I'm thinking, Dr. Harley, of like Fannie Lou Hamer, right? So how we sort of expand this notion of what counts as labor beyond trade unions or factories or railroads. And we think about these other aspects, we might bring in more diverse both gender and class voices.
Well, the great work of the young scholar at UVA, Talifa LaFleur, award-winning text on the use of convict lease workers, particularly Black women in the South. There's a whole new cadre of young scholars who are doing stuff about corporal punishment and the labor aspects of that. So her work is just phenomenal in that arena. There are a number of other scholars who are studying kind of labor and convict lease, and not only the labor part, but kind of the gendered aspect of that. How did Black women? And so in the chapter of my long-awaited forthcoming book project, I talk about, for instance, how Black women during World War I were forced to labor under the work of fight law. It was supposed to apply to particularly men who did not join the army or did military engagement. Well, they used that to apply to Black women. And so not only Black women had to show that they worked, but they had to work for a white family. So I have these really quite compelling stories about how Black women's bodies were arrested, brutalized, sexually assaulted because they didn't have a visual means of work, because they happened to be sitting on their porch waiting after a long day of work. And it's so compelling that I can't share it. You have to wait till the book is out. And I can't remember the scholar at NYU, she wanted to know all the sources, like, wait, the book will be out at some point or another. But there are multiple ways, and I'm glad you asked the question about imagine, because actually the title of my forthcoming book is Imagining Reality. So how do we imagine our lives and our real lived experiences, even if they don't coincide? In other words, how do Black folks imagine themselves to be equal, maybe superior to other people at given historical moments? I think of Octavia Butler, and we were one of the few people in the country to ever have her come to the campus years ago. It was just a groundbreaking moment. But so the imagine part is critical here, because we live imagined lives as well as quotidian lives. And so I think this is an exciting way to look at labor and migration and the multiple layers, because my paper I gave in South Africa, I began not with somebody going to South Africa, but a picture I took of some students in my class at the National Portrait Gallery. Some of those students had never, ever been to that library, and they were from Washington, D.C. So migration has to be examined on multiple levels before you can get somebody up north, and before have to get people from neighborhoods that they don't feel that they even welcome to go to, like the Smithsonian. So one student with a whole family. And so I opened up my talk talking about local migration and what does migration mean as one of the many layers to look at it.
There actually is another aspect to that. The convict labor under the 13th Amendment, of course, still happens, and it has become much more highly technical. There are convict laborers doing reservations for flights. Actually, even in terms of the digitization and processing of materials, some of that labor is being done by convict labor. Yeah.
Right here in the state of Maryland.
So, it's not just a historical phenomenon, and it has an impact on migration in that it means that jobs which otherwise would have had to have been localized in a community can be hidden behind prison walls. And the chance for people outside those walls to get those jobs is diminished because they're being done for a fraction of the wages by convicts who genuinely lack the freedom to really leave the jobs.
I mean, from an archivist perspective, I mean, how significant are corrections institutions, broadly defined penitentiaries, within the archives that you work with? Alongside the factory, do you also have the prison as a site of labor, as a site of labor organization, as a site of interest for an archival, object, archival initiative?
I think most of the AFL-CIO records kind of reflect kind of political position against convict labor.
Oh, yeah.
Starting, from the founding, I think the founding convention of the AFL in 1881, that was one of the principles, was war against convict labor, flat out. So, but it's basically a political position in terms of actually documenting or organizing workers in prison or, like kind of a broader justice issue. It's absent, largely absent. I think the question of like sharecropping labor too, that like in the AFL era right up until the 1930s, the official AFL movement pretty much did not organize unskilled workers of any kind by and large, so that really didn't start until the Congress of Industrial Organization in the 1930s. For this, kind of preparing this talk, I was doing a keyword search around the question of lynching in the CIO news to see how that was covered. And the only named person that was threatened with lynching was a labor organizer, was a sharecropper in cotton fields in California, which kind of showed you a lot of different things about the CIO's position. One is, it's very much like convict labor. There's an official, consistent opposition or support for anti-lynching legislation, a formal political position always on the annual legislative agenda. But beyond that, you can see in the newspaper, it's an actual organizing against lynching is pretty much absent unless it's directly connected to labor organizing. So that broader issue, unlike say today where you have Black Lives Matter where it's broadened out beyond just organized labor, in the 30s, the sense I get, even the progressive wing, the CIO, saw it in very narrow terms and portrayed it as strictly a labor issue rather than a broader issue of equality. And I think what really I think is great when you talk about like what did workers bring in terms of imagining their future? And one of the things I think it's really amazing is, just that idea of equality, like, and looking at the labor movement and saying, why don't you live up to your principles of equality? That's what we need. And so when African American workers come up from the South into the steel industry, they come into cities like Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, Youngstown, Ohio, Gary, Indiana. The steel companies have created segregated company housing. When workers naturally integrated with European immigrants who didn't carry over kind of the American racism, the steel companies forcibly segregated them and created segregated schools, segregated housing. And the African American workers, there's a great example in Youngstown where they segregated company housing that was relatively modern and progressive, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so you had a boulevard in the middle, and you had the African American section, and then the section for immigrant, primarily Eastern Southern European. And the African Americans coming from the South would come from a sharecropping environment, and this environment of, you know, control and everything, refused to live there, and went and lived in independent boarding houses. She had names of streets that were like Frederick Douglass Avenue or Booker T. Washington Avenue that were populated by Eastern European immigrants, because the African American Wars brought that idea of equality and independence, and wouldn't, abide by what the kind of segregation the company wanted to impose. And in terms of the labor unions, like in 1919, you had like 21 different unions, skilled workers unions in the steel industry, which pretty much all excluded African Americans, so that African Americans ended up in the labor pool. And so within the union movement, the idea was, we want to bring that equality. Well, what does that mean on the job? We've been in labor in the South. We don't want that. You know, what we imagine our future is, we get into the steel and we start at the labor crew, and then we work our way up into operating the cranes, and then into skilled trades, into being machinists and so forth. And that was the tremendous aspiration that really didn't begin to be met until the 30s and the CIO. And then still it was a continuous battle right on through, you know, affirmative action and really to today now.
So thinking about all of those things, I think you all have left us with questions for all the graduate students in the room, that there are other things for you to be thinking about, expanding how we can think about all of these issues of labor and migration, and including imagination as a very, very key element in it. Daryl, Sharon, Will, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much everyone for coming out. There's a lot of folks tweeting and live streaming, so thank you for joining us digitally as well. I want to thank our panel, and I want to remind everyone of a few upcoming AADHum activities and events that might be of interest to you. We are now in our 4th incubator series right now that's hosted jointly with MIT, the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, where we are talking about social movements. I invite you to join us on Mondays at 2 p.m. in the basement of Form A 0301 to learn some digital technology and have a good conversation about theory and practice around the notion of Black social movements. Also, our final conversation series will be held on May 11th in this space at 10 a.m. as well.
May 9th.
May 9th, okay, May 9th, thank you, at 10 a.m. in this space at 10:30. And that conversation, I get it all wrong. And that final conversation will be commemorating and memorializing Black culture. So please come out and join us for another wonderful panel discussion then. Thank you once again for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you know that Maureen Shepperson, she wrote that article on blacks and
I was just thinking
This
white
is really
Americans
good.
about that ship that was coming from India.
I like that we
and was
ended
going to,
thinking about
I think, Barbados.